So this class is called Civil Liberties, but we're actually going to cover a couple of different kinds of, let's go with the term freedoms for the moment. We're going to look at civil rights and civil liberties, right? So the last part of this class is specifically about civil rights. What does this distinction mean? Well, it's easy to overstate it, so I don't want to emphasize too much the distinction between civil rights and civil liberties, and there are going to be places where they kind of bleed together. But there's a general conceptual distinction that we can draw, right? So one way to think about this is to turn to the political theorist Isaiah Berlin. So Isaiah Berlin talked about what he termed negative freedoms and positive freedoms. Negative freedoms are the kinds of things that you can do on your own power so long as no one interferes with you. An example of a negative freedom would be freedom of thought, right? You can think whatever you want, right? So long as no one interferes with, say, your physical ability to think. Another example would be freedom of speech. You can say whatever you want so long as no one takes some kind of positive action to stop you, right, from speaking or writing or publishing or whatever. Now, positive liberties are different. Positive liberties are the sorts of freedoms that you need some kind of outside help to exercise. So an example that's often given of a positive freedom would be a sort of like basic welfare safety net, right? Like none of your other freedoms really matter if you don't have the capacity to exercise them, right? So if your basic needs, for instance, aren't met, then you might say that you have a positive liberty in terms of, you know, entitlement to a sort of like basic level of support from your government. As we will see when we turn to civil liberties, another example of, to civil rights, another example of a positive freedom comes into play when we see cases of discrimination. So the state determines that it has a compelling interest in preventing discrimination, you know, in the interest of promoting liberty and peace. So the state has to step in and do something in order to ensure that everyone's civil rights are respected. So that would be a positive freedom. So as I've outlined it here on the slide, you can see that they have slightly different purposes, right? So civil rights are intended to protect or promote equality. So equality is not something that we necessarily are concerned about as individuals so much as we are as members of groups. Generally speaking, people are not oppressed as individuals, right? John Smith does not get oppressed, but maybe a group that John Smith belongs to gets oppressed historically, right? So whether or not that, you know, that might be socioeconomic status, or, you know, maybe John Smith is an immigrant. These are all examples of group membership. So this can include race, ethnicity, alienage, gender, sexual orientation. Those are all groups, right? Social groups that a person can belong to. So civil rights are intended to protect equality among groups so that we don't have some groups being treated better, especially by the government, than others. So civil rights are often protected not only by constitutional protections, but also statutory protections. So most of the things you're thinking of are actually probably like the kinds of protections that we get from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or from the Americans with Disabilities Act. Right? So curb cuts, for instance, if a new sidewalk is built, making that accessible is required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's not a constitutional protection, though. So one of the questions that you should be thinking about as we go forward is, why is this a constitutional issue? And what effect does it have to make this a constitutionally protected freedom? We could do it by statute, right? So for instance, you know, federal statutes do some things really well. For instance, they can make very specific rules that are responsive to changing situations in a way that a constitutional protection just can't. Now, that said, constitutional protections are also very difficult to roll back. So freedoms that are protected by the Constitution are more secure, right, than freedoms that are protected by statutes. So these are just some initial distinctions to bear in mind. Now, as I said, civil rights are intended to protect equality. Civil liberties, these are more of the negative freedoms, are intended to protect individual freedoms from interference by state actors. We're going to start with the First Amendment. The First Amendment is kind of the paradigmatic set of civil liberties. These are all individual freedoms. You have an individual freedom to practice your religion without interference. You have an individual freedom to not be compelled to practice a state-established religion. Same with speech, assembly. These are all freedoms that you hold as an individual, not as a group member. And you'll see this come out very clearly in the cases, right? Especially when we get to the freedom of speech, the court puts a lot of emphasis on these being individual liberties. So again, this is just kind of a preliminary set of distinctions so that you have an idea of the kinds of concepts that we're going to be working with. Now, that said, for the first part of the class, we really are just going to be talking about civil liberties, right, or individual rights. We'll turn again to civil rights at the end of the class, and I'll kind of give a refresher regarding this distinction then. When we talk about civil liberties, what we're usually talking about are the first 10 amendments, right? So the Bill of Rights. So we're going to talk a lot initially about First Amendment freedoms. The Second Amendment, has to do with bearing arms. We don't have time, unfortunately, to cover that in this class. The Fourth Amendment deals with searches and seizures. The Fifth, the right to life, liberty, property. That these things cannot be taken from you by the government without due process of law. Double jeopardy, self-incrimination, takings. Right. So the Sixth Amendment also deals with your rights in criminal cases. Seventh, with your rights in civil cases. Eighth has to do with punishment. The Ninth we'll revisit when we get to civil rights, because many civil rights are actually sort of inferred from the Ninth Amendment, and also the 10th. But for the most part, what we're going to be looking at are these first 9. And again, not all of them. So we aren't going to spend any time on the Third Amendment. Sorry to those of you who are really interested in the quartering of troops, but it's just not a particularly vibrant section of constitutional law. We are going to spend a lot of time on the amendments that are going to potentially affect you personally. Right, so it's entirely possible that you might find yourself in a case where maybe your freedom of speech has been abridged, or your freedom of religion. Similarly, it's entirely possible that you might find yourself in a situation where you need to know your privacy rights when it comes to being subject to searches and seizures by authorities. Similarly, interrogations, your rights in a criminal trial, those things. So the stuff that we're going to focus on in this class are really the kinds of constitutional law that you might come into contact with as a citizen. So all of this raises a few questions, which I would strongly urge you to discuss on the discussion board. So first of all, why do we need these freedoms? Everything that we're going to be discussing, especially in the first part of the class, deals with the balance of power between the individual and the government. Well, isn't this sort of paranoid? Aren't we expressing an awful lot of distrust in our government? Why do we need the Bill of Rights to essentially protect us from our own government? This is a democracy. Isn't the government acting on our behalf? So this is one of the questions you should be asking yourself as you go forward. Why do we need these freedoms? Why do we need them to be outlined? And why do we need them to be so specifically outlined in our founding document, right, the Constitution? What is it about them that is so fundamental that we are going to include them in our Constitution rather than having them guaranteed by statute? So the next question then I would like to ask is the list too minimal? Right? Should we have more amendments? Should the Bill of Rights cover more stuff? So for instance, there's no prohibition on hate speech. We'll discuss this more when we get to freedom of speech, but there is no part of the Constitution that makes it constitutional to legally punish someone for engaging in hate speech. Is that the way it should be? Do you think we should amend the Constitution to change that? Similarly, there's no enumerated right to privacy in the Constitution. We're going to talk about this a lot when we get to the very end of the class, but there's no place in the Constitution where it says explicitly the right to privacy. But we think of this as being really fundamental, right? We'll see this idea come up when we talk about the Fourth Amendment. Maybe it's because we think of this freedom as being so fundamental that we, never bothered outlining it in the Constitution. We thought it was obvious. But should we amend the Bill of Rights to include more things? Conversely, is it too expansive? Do we really need all of these things embedded in the Constitution? right? So again, when something is embedded in the Constitution, it's very difficult to change. Is that necessarily desirable? You know, there are some things that we might be able to do better by, sort of more agile and changeable statutes. So keep this in mind as we're going. Is the list of rights too minimal? Is it too expansive? Why do we need these freedoms? What is the underlying attitude towards the government that is expressed by having these freedoms enshrined in the Bill of Rights? So this brings us to the first topic that we're going to cover in the class, and that is the First Amendment. So I've included here on the slide the text of the First Amendment. Pretty straightforward. It's not very long. It's only a few clauses. So I'm just going to go over it briefly. So it states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So I've put a few words here in bold because they're important words. So number one, Congress shall make no law. One of the very basic things to consider as we're reading all these cases and as we're discussing questions about constitutionality is that constitutional law deals with government action. For something to be a constitutional question, there has to be some action on the part of the government. So the first part of your book touches on the incorporation of the Bill of Rights. This refers to the application of the Bill of Rights to the states. This was a gradual process. It took place over a number of years. As I say, or as I've said in other places in this course, if you're not familiar with all of these ideas, I'd suggest reviewing chapters 1 through 3. There's a more detailed account, for instance, in chapter 3 of incorporation. But this is an important idea because the First Amendment says Congress, right? That's the federal government. So the legislative branch of the federal government shall make none of these laws. Well, what about your municipal government? What if your public school decides that they're going to have a sectarian prayer to begin every day? That's not Congress. Well, for constitutional purposes, not for all of the amendments, but for many of them, and we'll discuss this as we go, this has been now interpreted through the 14th Amendment to apply to all levels of government, so to the states as well as to the federal government. So when the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law, that applies also to state legislatures and all of the lower levels of government. So for something to even be a constitutional issue, there has to be government action involved. As you're reading the cases, this should always be one of the questions you ask. What is the government action here? What's the nature of it? What has the government done or not done that it was supposed to, do or not do? Okay, so respecting an establishment of religion. Okay, so we have establishment of religion, that's state action, right? That means the state has established a particular religion and is compelling the people to abide by it. Right? So what were the framers thinking about here? Well, we can think of a couple of historical and contemporary theocracies, places where there is an official state religion. And they didn't want this, right? They reject this specifically with the Establishment Clause. Okay, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So this is a negative freedom. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. This has to do with practice, the freedom to practice your religion without government interference. Okay, and we'll get into the rest of these in more detail as we go, but of course the freedom of speech seems very straightforward. Obviously we have a number of limits on that, of the press, right? So these are all the various media that encompass now the press. The right of the people peaceably to assemble, right? So this is your right to associate with others of your choice and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That can mean a lot of stuff, but it's often interpreted as referring to protest specifically. So we're going to touch on all of these different parts of the First Amendment, but we're going to begin with the establishment of religion and the free exercise thereof. In the next voice thread, I'm going to get into more detail about specific cases, but I just want to kind of put a few things on your radar from the outset. So first of all, when we're talking about freedom of religion, there's this important distinction again between establishment and free exercise, right? So when you encounter a freedom of religion case, this is one of the first questions you should ask yourself. Is this a free exercise issue? Is it an establishment issue? There's some key concepts to consider as well. So state neutrality, right? We seem to strive to have neutrality on the part of the government, but what does neutrality actually mean? Does it mean clearing all religion out of the public? That's one way of getting neutrality, but that could potentially, trample on the religious exercise rights, especially of a lot of people, right? By sort of excluding them from the public sphere. Well, alternately, maybe the government could try to represent a lot of different religions. So one way to get neutrality is by plurality, allowing sort of 1,000 flowers to bloom, right? And not interfering with any of them. But then the government also has to be careful not to show favoritism, right? So no bias in favor, no bias against. So we're going to look at all of these different ways of talking about neutrality. But as you, again, approach these cases, you're going to hear terms like a neutral law of general applicability. The question you should be asking yourself then is, in this case, how is the court defining neutral, right? What is their conception of neutrality that they're using, and what are the principles that go into that? So specifically, the cases that you're going to be looking at the beginning of this section are a couple of important ones. So there's US v. Ballard, right? This deals with the IM movement. There's also Reynolds v. US, right? So Reynolds v. US is from the 1870s. It's an early free exercise case. It deals with plural marriage. But the sort of question that unites many of these early cases that you're going to look at. So Ballard, Reynolds, there are additional cases, right? So Seeger and Welch both deal with conscientious objection. Well, the court in these cases is going to be asked to define a religion. And not only to define a religion, but to make determinations about which religions actually merit recognition on the part of the state and which ones don't. Now, this is a very sort of fraught and dangerous business for the court to be wading into. So some questions to consider. Do you necessarily want the Supreme Court determining what a religion is or isn't? Okay, that said, then what are the key aspects of a religion, right? What makes something a religion? Does there have to be a belief, for instance, in a supreme being? Or can it simply be an ethical system? If there's no transcendent piece to it, right? No belief in an afterlife, no belief in a supreme deity, sort of no metaphysical pieces, then can it still be treated as a religion? Or is it then just something more like an ethical system or a philosophy? Well, the court is going to ask all of these questions, and it's going to take a couple of different approaches. So one will be simply saying, we don't want to define what a religion is, right? Well, they don't really have that option because, they have to uphold these freedoms of religion. Well, then you have to have some idea of what a religion is. So they're going to look at the truth of belief, right? Or the truth of the beliefs, yeah. So we don't necessarily obviously want the court determining which religions are true, which ones aren't. I think that would be a political nightmare. Another question they'll ask is, well, what about sincerity of belief? Instead of pronouncing on the plausibility of the belief system, we will simply assess whether or not the person, who's looking for the protection in this case is, a sincere believer. So the court in this first set of cases is going to try to outline what makes something a religion, right? What are the key aspects of religion? And then also kind of try to outline its own role, right? So you'll see the court saying outright, there are things we don't want to do. Just as a sort of political science point, one thing you should note in these early cases is how the court talks about religion. You'll see this real deep-seated caution. They treat it sort of like a ticking time bomb, like it's something that's very dangerous, that has to be handled very carefully, or it might result in all sorts of conflict. So we'll see this theme kind of going away and reemerging periodically as we go through the religion cases. But one question I want to ask is, is that the case? Is there something about religion that makes it more volatile than other, potential conflicts or differences that a society might face? Or is the court approaching this all wrong? Should the court, maybe be a little bit more bold in sort of making allowances for free exercise, even up to maybe what Reynolds was asking in terms of plural marriage? All right, so we're going to turn to those cases next.